Chapter 16 Part A. We found my lady with no light in the room but the reading lamp. The shade was screwed down so as to overshadow her face. Instead of looking up at us in her usual straightforward way, she sat close at the table, and kept her eyes fixed obstinately on an open book. "Officer," she said, "is it important to the inquiry you are conducting, to know beforehand if any person now in this house wishes to leave it?" "Most important, my lady." "I have to tell you, then, that Miss Verinder proposes going to stay with her aunt, Mrs. Abel White, of Frising Hall. She has arranged to leave us the first thing tomorrow morning." Sergeant Cuff looked at me. I made a step forward to speak to my mistress and, feeling my heart fail me, if I must own it, took a step back again, and said nothing. "May I ask your ladyship when Miss Verinder informed you that she was going to her aunt's?" inquired the sergeant. "About an hour since," answered my mistress. Sergeant Cuff looked at me once more. They say old people's hearts are not very easily moved. My heart couldn't have thumped much harder than it did now, if I had been 25 again. "I have no claim, my lady," says the sergeant, "to control Miss Verinder's actions. All I can ask you to do is to put off her departure, if possible, till later in the day. I must go to Frising Hall myself tomorrow morning and I shall be back by 2 o'clock, if not before. If Miss Verinder can be kept here till that time, I should wish to say 2 words to her, unexpectedly, before she goes." My lady directed me to give the coachman her orders, that the carriage was not to come for Miss Rachel until 2 o'clock. "Have you more to say?" she asked of the sergeant, when this had been done. "Only one thing, your ladyship. If Miss Verinder is surprised at this change in the arrangements, please not to mention me as being the cause of putting off her journey." My mistress lifted her head suddenly from her book as if she was going to say something, checked herself by a great effort, and, looking back again at the open page, dismissed us with a sign of her hand. "That's a wonderful woman," said Sergeant Cuff, when we were out in the hall again. "But for her self-control, the mystery that puzzles you, Mr. Betteridge, would have been at an end tonight." At those words, the truth rushed at last into my stupid old head. For the moment, I suppose I must have gone clean out of my senses. I seized the sergeant by the collar of his coat, and pinned him against the wall. "Damn you," I cried out, "there's something wrong about Miss Rachel, and you have been hiding it from me all this time." Sergeant Cuff looked up at me, flat against the wall, without stirring a hand, or moving a muscle of his melancholy face. "Ah," he said, "you've guessed it at last." My hand dropped from his collar, and my head sunk on my breast. Please to remember, as some excuse for my breaking out as I did, that I had served the family for 50 years. Miss Rachel had climbed upon my knees, and pulled my whiskers, many and many a time when she was a child. Miss Rachel, with all her faults, had been, to my mind, the dearest and prettiest and best young mistress that ever an old servant waited on, and loved. I begged Sergeant Cuff's pardon, but I am afraid I did it with watery eyes, and not in a very becoming way. "Don't distress yourself, Mr. Betteridge," says the sergeant, with more kindness than I had any right to expect from him. "In my line of life, if we were quick at taking offense, we shouldn't be worth salt to our porridge. If it's any comfort to you, collar me again. You don't in the least know how to do it, but I'll overlook your awkwardness in consideration of your feelings." He curled up at the corners of his lips, and, in his own dreary way, seemed to think he had delivered himself of a very good joke. I led him into my own little sitting room, and closed the door. "Tell me the truth, Sergeant," I said. "What do you suspect? It's no kindness to hide it from me now." "I don't suspect," said Sergeant Cuff. "I know." My unlucky temper began to get the better of me again. "Do you mean to tell me, in plain English," I said, "that Miss Rachel has stolen her own diamond?" "Yes," says the sergeant, "that is what I mean to tell you, in so many words. Miss Verinder has been in secret possession of the Moonstone from first to last, and she has taken Rosanna Spearman into her confidence, because she has calculated on our suspecting Rosanna Spearman of the theft. There is the whole case in a nutshell. Collar me again, Mr. Betteridge. If it's any vent to your feelings, collar me again. God help me, my feelings were not to be relieved in that way. Give me your reasons. That was all I could say to him. You shall hear my reasons tomorrow, said the sergeant. If Miss Verinder refuses to put off her visit to her aunt, which you will find Miss Verinder will do, I shall be obliged to lay the whole case before your mistress tomorrow. And, as I don't know what may come of it, I shall request you to be present, and to hear what passes on both sides. Let the matter rest for tonight. No, Mr. Betteridge, you don't get a word more on the subject of the Moonstone out of me. There is your table spread for supper. That's one of the many human infirmities which I always treat tenderly. If you will ring the bell, I'll say grace for what we are going to receive. I wish you a good appetite to it, Sergeant, I said. My appetite is gone. I'll wait and see you served, and then I'll ask you to excuse me, if I go away, and try to get the better of this by myself. I saw him served with the best of everything, and I shouldn't have been sorry if the best of everything had choked him. The head gardener, Mr. Begbie, came in at the same time, with his weekly account. The sergeant got on the subject of roses and the merits of grass walks and gravel walks immediately. I left the two together, and went out with a heavy heart. This was the first trouble I remember for many a long year which wasn't to be blown off by a whiff of tobacco, and which was even beyond the reach of Robinson Crusoe. Being restless and miserable, and having no particular room to go to, I took a turn on the terrace, and thought it over in peace and quietness by myself. It doesn't much matter what my thoughts were. I felt wretchedly old, and worn out, and unfit for my place, and began to wonder, for the first time in my life, when it would please God to take me. With all this, I held firm, notwithstanding, to my belief in Miss Rachel. If Sergeant Cuff had been Solomon in all his glory, and had told me that my young lady had mixed herself up in a mean and guilty plot, I should have had but one answer for Solomon, wise as he was: you don't know her, and I do. My meditations were interrupted by Samuel. He brought me a written message from my mistress. Going into the house to get a light to read it by, Samuel remarked that there seemed a change coming in the weather. My troubled mind had prevented me from noticing it before. But, now my attention was roused, I heard the dogs uneasy, and the wind moaning low. Looking up at the sky, I saw the rack of clouds getting blacker and blacker, and hurrying faster and faster over a watery moon. Wild weather coming, Samuel was right, wild weather coming.